Welcome to the 2020 NATO Talk, to all those who have joined us again after what was hopefully a delightful lunch break, and welcome to all those of you who just joined us. Welcome back and welcome. We will now get to listen to this year's keynote speech. Let me explain to you what connection, what link I have to the speaker that we invited. I am from Hesse. I went to university in Frankfurt, and as a young lady, I went to Offenbach, Frankfurt's quote-unquote idyllic neighboring town, and there's a leather museum where shoes are on exhibit. I passed one exhibit. You see a photo of it right here. And this exhibit are the shoes that our keynote speaker wore when he was sworn into office in 1985 as the Minister for Environmental Affairs of the federal state of Hesse. And as you may be aware, I come from a small village in Hesse where politics were not that important. And when somebody asked me, Julia, what is politics? I would have said at my age, well, politics, that is men in suits, like in the Tagesschau, the nightly news, that tell me what I need to do. And when I passed those shoes, these tennis shoes, I got a first sense of, hold on, politics is not just something that is what people tell me what I need to do. I can also ask myself, what do I want to do and how do I want to do it? So what works for me? What do I want to do? And that's something that I have been able to implement so far. I am working in security policy, and at the same time, I'm a yoga teacher. And when I'm here at events like that, people think, oh, you're a yoga teacher. How can you marry those two things? Or if I'm roaming around the yoga community and I tell them I went to Afghanistan with the Bundeswehr, people ask me, how can you even do that? You're a yoga teacher. You went with the army to Afghanistan. I often get to a point where I quote the speaker, today's speaker, yes, I understand, never again war, but never again Auschwitz. So thank you very much for your inspiration with these shoes. That was very impactful for me and had a long-lasting effect on me. And I look forward to you inspiring us again. Please welcome with me former Minister for Foreign Affairs, Joschka Fischer.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk on this very important topic to you today. NATO, in looking at geopolitics in the 21st century, is indeed a very important institution for our security as Germans and as Europeans. So NATO is still an important matter or question to us, and there are many ways of trying to find an answer as to how important NATO still is. Let me now discuss that today, also against the backdrop of the discussion we've had so far at this conference. I joined you via video to follow this conference. And so right off the bat, I would like to get to the point, bottom line up front. You mentioned my CV. I would have never thought, and I was always proud of being a very imaginative person, but it wasn't sufficient, apparently, but I would have never thought that a member of the Green Party, who for many years and decades had led security policy debates in his party, also in connection with Bosnia, for example, and the decay of Yugoslavia and the Kosovo issue. I would have never thought that I would experience that an American president at some point in time would declare NATO to be obsolete, that an American president would conduct a policy that is basically a wrecking ball
and has the impact of a wrecking ball vis-à-vis the transatlantic community. For me, the transatlantic community was, and has been right off the bat, something that was part of German democracy. I was born in southern Germany and grew up there, and then back then, having American GIs and service members present, seeing them move around and train, that was something that was part and parcel of my experience. As a Green politician, the left wing of my party had a different view on that, but never the American president. But he's still, the current president, has a different view on that. And that's my first hypothesis. NATO was damaged heavily by that. And please don't give in to that illusion that everything will get better just by itself. That won't happen. I think the biggest mistake that we have done and committed together in the transatlantic family happened in 1989. In 1989, and during the year of happiness and joy, when the Warsaw Pact disappeared, and when later the Soviet Union was dissolved and disappeared, when we lost the enemy of the Cold War, when the Cold War came to an end, when the thermonuclear the threats of destruction were done away with. You know, all these moments, this year was a moment of joy leading to the reunification of Germany. But contrary to the generation of 1945, neither in Europe, nor in Germany, nor in the United States did we have the courage and the power, and did we see the need to rethink our world. And that is, for me, a very decisive hiatus. Everything that we have to deal with today, including Donald Trump and everything else, stems from that time of this hiatus, of this fissure. I think if we want to keep NATO, and we do need to keep NATO, we need to try to correct this mistake. We have to be honest about that, and we need to take responsibility for that. What order disappeared in 1989, and what order did replace the old order? I think back then what started was the large separation and division in the transatlantic era. In 1989, the United States interpreted 1989 as a triumph. They said, the United States said, we won, we are the only world power, and then the US tried to build an American empire, and that went wrong very quickly. It ended in the quicksand of Iraq, the country of Euphrates and Tigris. And so suddenly the definition of neoconservatism was done. The Europeans drew a pacifist conclusion from that, which was also delusional. Eternal peace, according to Immanuel Kant, was something that people thought had erupted. A peace dividend, whatever a security zone from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains meant. So what we had then was a big illusion that was just as dangerous as the triumphant interpretation of the United States. With Donald Trump, all these things became apparent. I think 4 more years of Donald Trump would have led to the end of the West and to the end of NATO. It wouldn't have survived it, because we live in a global order that is changing dynamically. We can see that in a very brief and clear example. Yesterday in Hanoi, in Vietnam, the biggest free trade agreement was signed for East Asia and Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific region under the leadership of China. A few years before that, right after Donald Trump took office,
once he was inaugurated, he pulled the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from TTIP. It was an agreement led by the United States, and he reversed that. Just compare this one event, or these two events rather, and then you can see what we are dealing with. It's the dissolution of an order that had governed the United States, and there's a new order now that is more Asia-centric or China-centric. And the question that is being derived from that is, what does that mean for us? And that leads me straight to our topic. The transatlanticism after the Second World War came without an alternative. In the center of Germany, in the heart of the country in Berlin, and at the inner-German border, the Red Army was present, the Soviet Union was present, and it stayed there. So it was a question of survival, basically. So transatlanticism was a matter and a question of survival. That, too, in 1989, was drowning in everything that happened then. Today, with the rise of China, a much older order is resurging again in Eurasia. Europe is the westernmost arm of and part of the Eurasian continent. If I take a look at how important trade matters are in the rise of China, then I don't think that NATO has a perspective on that and will have weight in that question. It is a highly political question. Can Europe's interests and North America's interests, can they be aligned and summarized, the interests vis-à-vis China? I think as long as we talk about common values, you will have an easy time finding common ground. But when it comes to interests, I think the differences are much more stark and meaningful. So the new world that is currently being established and evolving shows that. And also the change in roles shows that. The role the United States play or Europe plays. So there's a completely new role. The traditional, conventional NATO was defined by the bon mot, by its first Secretary General, the British General Lord Bismay. And he said it quite clearly. He said the purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. All these 3 points were important for us. That does not mean that we were supposed to be kept small, but that we had to be aware, in our very own interest, of falling prey to a nationalization of German security policy. That would have been harrowing for us, and we would have lost. So from a German point of view, NATO has a geopolitically and historically charged internal and domestic German task. Ladies and gentlemen, it is also clear, however, that this reasoning is no longer sufficient. It is important, but insufficient today for the legalization of such an alliance. There are a lot of discussions going on as to what Europeans have to do and what Germans would be willing to do, but nobody's talking on the actual matters. Everybody talks about taking on more responsibility. Everybody knows what is being alluded to with that, meaning more military engagement, more money spent on defense. But nobody, none of those responsible, says that clearly and spells it out. Why?
because there is a deeply rooted aversion against a militarily backed strategic foreign policy in our country, and that has to do with the two world wars of the first half of the 20th century. And that is so deeply rooted, and it has been passed on from one generation to another. It's nothing that I criticize, because there were very good reasons as to why Germans became pacifists and why they committed and transformed themselves after 1945 into a non-military country and government. For every coalition in government, it will be highly difficult and challenging to overcome that. This is not only a question for the left-wing party to deal with, it is also a question that arises in conservative circles. That is why I believe that we will, and I think this is inevitable, even though this is risky for our country, we will have to find a way for this type of Europe that we have now to be able to take that step towards its own defense capabilities. We want this Europe to be able to have its own security and defense policy. If you ask me, it should happen within the framework of the Transatlantic Alliance. Without Germany, it will not be possible. Let's not be delusional. What will be possible with Germany, though? There's a lot of discussions as to what we need militarily, but just take a closer look at the political limitations.
We have what we call a parliamentary army. Of course, that leads to certain limitations. And those are serious limitations. Or we say we need common efforts on armament in Europe. That's not that easy with Germany as a partner, if you look at the controversies we have around that. So I could mention a number of things, and the deeper you dig, then the more serious these questions get. Because the German people has this deeply rooted conviction, never again. No more war, and that doesn't only mean that we don't want to shoot anymore, but also we don't really want to be a serious player in global politics. But that will not be possible if we need a stronger European role in the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we talk about the future of NATO, then the only possible way is for the US and Europe to redefine their roles. And I believe that, as a matter of fact, this means a political reinvention of NATO. Because we are in a situation where it can no longer be taken for granted that the US guarantees security for the rest of the alliance. We no longer have this benevolent hegemon, and those times will not come back. And on the other hand, and I do not know how Washington will react, not even under a Biden administration, on the other hand, this will mean that Europeans will ask to have greater autonomy, greater sovereignty, because this is the only way for NATO to work in future. So what we used to take for granted for so long is no longer the ideal scenario for us. I mean, if the US still have this strong role, great, but I believe that will be an exception rather than the rule. And I believe that this means that we need a reconceptualization of the transatlantic alliance, and that won't be easy. Just to be clear, I believe that there is no alternative to NATO, and we Europeans cannot do without the security guarantees offered by the US for several reasons. I don't want to go into detail. And on the other hand, the US would be too weak to succeed in the competition with China if it wasn't for the EU on their side. But still, I am seeing a new triangle. China, the US, and Europe if we Europeans do our job properly. But there are also so many contradictions in the transatlantic family arising from different roles. The US is still a global power, and the EU wants to become a global power and has to become a global power. And if we do our homework, then we will manage within the next 2 decades to, well, maybe use European capabilities to stave off the risks arising from our foreign policy environment. You had a discussion with the Turkish ambassador today. Just look at the Eastern Mediterranean. This is a European challenge. You can't say this is a task for the US. So I believe if we manage to deal with these issues, that would be quite a lot. And then take digital transformation. I believe there's a great need in this area because security in future will be guaranteed by hardware and software too. So how are we going to cooperate with the US here? Can we Europeans accept that we just give our data to businesses on the American West Coast? This is a contradiction, and these are big topics and big questions to ask for the future. But still, all in all, I believe that a stronger Europe and a strong transatlantic relationship don't contradict each other. We just have to find a new and innovative approach. And we Germans have to start to think strategically again. In politics, most of all. Who are we dealing with? What are we dealing with? And this means that we will also have to stand up for our own position in the context of Europe. But I believe that this will only strengthen the transatlantic relations rather than weakening them. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Fischer, for this very good analysis. It reminds me of the discussions we used to have years and years ago. My name is Claude Chariot. I used to be State Secretary at the German Foreign Office and Ambassador of Germany to Washington, D.C. Today, you promoted the Europeans doing more, just as you did as a foreign minister. You promoted the Europeans doing more for security and defense policy, but complementary to NATO. Could you elaborate on that, please? Well, I believe that we are fully integrated, so there's no alternative. So the capabilities that we developed were not capabilities for NATO or the West European Union, and they were always the same capabilities. That's different when countries aren't fully integrated militarily, but I never saw a contradiction here. I always thought that the transatlantic bridge can only work if we have a strong transatlantic pillar, but also a strengthened European pillar. One difficult question for a German audience, at least, is this. What about defense spending? The Germans don't like to talk about it. it is still an important question. Oh, and also, excuse me, the question of nuclear sharing, that is extremely important. The Germans don't like this question. Well, I also hoped I wouldn't have to talk about it. But I asked myself this question in my last book, too, and I looked at all the options. So, what's the alternative? France, maybe, but this is just going to get us into a deep, deep swamp. First of all, I'm not absolutely convinced that France is really serious. Then, do we really want a German finger on the nuclear button on this continent? I'm not sure about that. And then, third, can we really do without the US here and the protection the US offers? No, I don't think so. And this is why I think that from a national point of view, we cannot do without NATO and nuclear sharing. Thank you very much for this very clear answer. Let's move away from military topics and move towards the free trade agreement that you mentioned, RCEP, in Asia. 15 Asian states, led by China, made this new agreement, replacing TPP, the agreement negotiated by President Obama. And you said that we Europeans, we Germans, have to act and react now. Do you think it is time to try and revive TTIP, as we used to call it back then? We could give it a new name. But don't we have to set common standards for Europe and for the US that others could choose to join? Isn't that a crucial question for our future? I've always been in favor of a transatlantic free trade agreement. But I don't understand this kind of worry-free attitude of the German government. These famous chlorinated chickens that we've mentioned, chlorinated poultry, we talked about that so much, and we said, how? Well, the Americans have a different understanding of hygiene, and they are not willing to eat non-chlorinated frozen poultry. I mean, we could have chosen a different approach to this agreement by really taking cultural differences seriously and trying to explain them, because we do have these differences. It is not about the Americans trying to force something that's not hygienic, that is disgusting on us. Quite the contrary, they may feel the same about us too. And there are several examples. Is it worth to try again? Well, I believe that the Democrats in the US don't have multilateral trade agreements on their agenda right now, because domestically it is too easy to turn that into a bone of contention. I understand your concerns, and I believe that right now, when it comes to customs and trade agreements, it'll be hard to really get anywhere right now. But can't we then look at shared norms and standards? Because the unions and also certain movements in US often say, okay, let's take a step towards Europe because they are a step ahead when it comes to standards, so maybe we could find an agreement here. Well, if that was true, then I would absolutely be in favor. But I'm not sure it is. So for example, we just set an almost global standards in terms of data protection in the EU, and I believe that other standards could follow. We can just do it within the EU. Of course, this may not be without conflict, but I believe that our citizens, and maybe also the American citizens, will value this effort. I believe that Europe has enormous potential to make progress here and to push progress. I share that view. Let's now move on to technology that you mentioned. I would like to ask you about 5G. So the question is, should we include Huawei? We know that there are certain security risks. Well, security risks always exist, right? Of course, they do. But we know that it is a fact that we have two European businesses, Ericsson and Nokia, who are world market leaders together with Huawei. Wouldn't this be an opportunity to create a European champion? Maybe even by encouraging other businesses to get on board, try to create a European champion, maybe encourage Siemens to participate. Isn't that an option? I believe that we are making a grave mistake when dealing with China. I believe that, first of all, we have to agree across the Atlantic. And my question to the US is, what do you want from China? Because without the US, China would not have risen to a digital world power. Also without funding and know-how from the US, because they helped put the Chinese financial system on its solid legs. I believe that China is too big to ignore it. It's just impossible. That would have terrible consequences for our economies. So what do we want from China? I believe that it would be wise and it would be good for Europeans to focus on a level playing field. So we are willing to trade with you, but based on equal terms. So we can't have a situation where large Chinese energy providers try to take over essential infrastructure in Europe. That would be unthinkable in China for the Chinese. So I believe we've made mistakes in the past, and we have to try to undo these mistakes. But we need to make common efforts for that. But I absolutely do not believe that we can isolate China, that we can shun China, that we can decouple from China. And I believe that this is a very, very dangerous and a wrong approach. And this is one of the huge differences between the EU and the US, I think. And I would hope for Europe to be strong enough to have a strong voice on normative issues such as human rights, common security, in the Taiwan Strait, for example, and other hotspots. I believe that we agree on these normative issues with the US, but it is much, much more difficult to find a common ground on trade, for example. And to conclude, I believe that the federal government is has currently chosen a good approach to Huawei, to try to find a way to not openly exclude Huawei.
When talking to Americans, be it Democrats, be it Republicans, everybody wants a tough position vis-à-vis China. You already mentioned that in your speech, and just now again that what concerns norms and enlightenment, we are in agreement with the Americans, with exception of the capital punishment, of course. But yes, of course, this is also valid in 15 to 20 states, I believe, the case. So with China, that would be a lot more difficult, having that common ground. You mentioned different interests between the US and Europe right now, economically, but do you see an opportunity for Europe in talks with the US to be able to convince the United States of leaving that very tough position on China? Well, I think we shouldn't overestimate what we are able to do. I think Europeans together, if they had a joint position, that could be meaningful. But in all that, you have to make clear that the normative side of things is of great importance to us, and that we need to stop thinking human rights are not really meaningful or don't matter so much. I think that's something that won't be sustainable. And so I do think that there is a lot of common ground with the Biden administration, but when it comes to that question, we should have a self-confident position when it comes to our interests. So let's not sell KUKA to China. Well, if you look into KUKA in detail, I think the Chinese have made a major mistake with KUKA. First of all, KUKA was not a strategic plan of the political leadership. KUKA was a large government in the Pearl River Delta that, for entrepreneurial reasons, was bought. And so our attitude at the time was, hey, we're a market economy. That does not concern us as a government or state, but these days are over, luckily. And so there were strategic considerations and intentions that people were ready to implement into state action. But KUKA, here in Germany, had kind of a wake-up call function for us. The time before KUKA is different than the time after KUKA. When you talk to top Chinese officials, they will admit to you behind closed doors that their assessment was not correct. But I must not get upset about that. The impact of the KUKA sale was positive, I think. It took us away from this business is everything approach and money is everything approach and everything else is meaningless. No, it didn't take us away from that, and it took us into a different direction on the first step. That brings me to another question, but before I ask that, I would like to invite you to ask questions either on your screens at home and type them out or here in the room. So now my last question, Mr. Fischer. You just said in your keynote address that the Europeanization and transatlanticism are not contradicting each other, but we need to learn to think strategically again as Germans. What do you mean by that, going beyond KUKA now? Well, you could compare Paris to Berlin. In Paris, there is a continuity. The continuity of a large European power, thanks to the genius of de Gaulle that survived major defeats all through to the present day, to today. There are institutions that think strategically. There is experience that's been gained. And there is a different worldview than what we have. I don't want to be like that, and I'm not demanding that, and we can't be like that. But what does the world look like? That's a decisive question. We were used to, since 1945, to be ready for the to have the United States be responsible for the hard facts of international policies. It was not us And this division of labor ended in 1989 and ended definitely with Donald Trump. And without having the capabilities as Germany, as the major country in the center of Europe, with its large population and the large economic potential, without these capabilities in Germany, Europe will not be able to elaborate its own security policy. Also, without France, we won't be able to do it. But this is decisive. We don't have a choice here. And there is one warning I need to issue. We should not relax and sit back all lightheartedly now and go back to business as usual with the Biden administration. I think that happened one time where we had an asteroid that hit Earth, an asteroid called Trump. I don't think he will return, but Donald Trump showed the world how it could go. And I think that's something we should beware of. And our situation can be described as precarious right now. And so we have to draw the conclusions from the experience with the asteroid Trump who hit us. And we have to do better next time. So trauma 33 to 45 needs to be overcome. Well, you can't just overcome a trauma. This is a terrible experience, a trauma. Mr. Chariot, I think you and I went together to the special meeting of the United Nations at the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp in 2004, I believe it was. And Kofi Annan, at that meeting of the General Assembly that he called, invited all of us, and I've never felt under such pressure personally, even though, of course, I had nothing to do personally with the Nazi past. Everybody spoke and took the floor. Israel, Poland, the victorious countries, everybody spoke. And I had the feeling, I don't know how you felt at the time, but I thought they were just waiting for one more speaker representing the perpetrators. And I had that quote-unquote pleasure of speaking then. And after that debate, I noticed how much trust there was and is placed in German democracy and how much support we enjoyed, but always based on the fact that we accept the guilt, that we don't shy away from it, that we never withdraw ourselves from the responsibility that we carry. And so it's not about overcoming the trauma, but it is about being aware of the trauma. We must never forget it. It's part of our national history. There is no escaping it. There is more German history and more to German history than 12 years, but these 12 years were decisive. And so I would say, no, it's not about overcoming trauma, but what's important is that we develop a responsible view of our world in awareness of this trauma. And I will now hand over to you for the questions from the audience. I would all like to tell you who asked the first questions. Dr. Klaus Chariot, he was a state secretary at the Foreign Office, and he once was ambassador of Germany to Washington, D.C., so you were the right candidate to ask these questions. Mr. Fischer, I have two questions for you from the internet, and one question is coming from the audience. So you'll have three questions now. So one domestic and one foreign policy question. The domestic question is this. We're looking to the federal elections next year. Do you think the Green Party will be the party that will decide who will provide the chancellor? Would you then accept nuclear sharing as a fact if there was a coalition between the CDU, CSU, and the Green Party? And secondly, if you were to if you were to found NATO again, would you exclude Turkey and instead include difficult partners like North Korea? And then thirdly, from the audience, I'm Tungo Wan from the Young Transatlanticists, a former foreign minister. You shared ideas with us on the relationship between the EU and the United States, and you said that both partners need to be and are in agreement of having to have a stronger weight vis-à-vis China, and that they need to work together. And you also said that it is hard to get together to that common ground after 4 years of Donald Trump. It requires effort from both the US and Europe. So that's the first part of my question now. So what concrete measures, apart from TTIP and other trade agreements, do you see as very specific measures to find common ground again and to close ranks? And once that has happened, what is the potential of such a strong axis between Europe and the United States in the Asian theater, also with a view of the more close cooperation with the Asian littoral states and the United States? So these first two questions were what again? A new political foundation of NATO with difficult partners and nuclear sharing. Well, on nuclear sharing, I will not be present in coalition negotiations for sure, so I can only speak for myself. And I would like to give you a brief answer to that question. When I became foreign minister back then, I accepted nuclear sharing. There was no opportunity for me to conclude this, to finish this. I tried, but it didn't work. Mr. Chariot then taught me otherwise. I remember that very well. No, I know these questions are very challenging. But I think those in my party who are responsible will conduct the negotiations, and they will have to solve that issue. And the party that will have to solve that question will do it. Is that a diplomatic statement? Well, no, it's a policy question. Will I get involved, yes or no? And I decided, no, I will not get involved, and I ask for your understanding. Granted. So a new foundation, a political foundation of NATO, and excluding difficult partners like Turkey. Well, what does excluding difficult partners mean? Should we have excluded the US under Donald Trump? Because he was difficult, wasn't he? I think it's not a secret that Donald Trump was difficult. Even Angela Merkel figured that one out. And she then, in Trudering, gave a historic speech where she said a few historic things. Turkey became a NATO member. Why? Well, because people wanted to tie and anchor Turkey in the West. Today, things are a bit more difficult, and the Erdogan government is conducting a policy that you can consider as NATO compatible only to a certain extent. Is something that is clear, I believe. But it would be absurd if we, as Europeans, were to, let's say, exclude or leave them to their own devices and kick them out of NATO, then we would commit a historic mistake, whether you like it or not. The Ottoman occupation of Constantinople created a power policy reality in Europe where, over centuries, Turkey was a flank state, a flank power. Later on, Russia took over that position. But how could we imagine and conceive a European Middle East policy without that bridge? It would be a mistake an unprecedented mistake. And then instead Japan, well, does Japan even want to join or would want to join NATO? It's so far away. They have nothing to do in the Atlantic. And it's also a country, as we know, with a difficult history. And it was a country with questionable allies back in their day. So honestly, the person who asked the question may not take it the wrong way. I think this is not a good path. This is not a good idea. We would commit a horrible mistake. The federal government, I think, deserves my support here. With its difficult partner, Erdogan, trying to stick with him and trying to not be offended, that's the only right thing to do, that there is to do. It was German diplomacy, specifically Angela Merkel, who said that this level of dialogue between Athens and Ankara needs to be re-established. Thank you. What about the third question from the audience? Yes. Look, I am observing with great concern what developments are going on in China. What is going on in Hong Kong is something that is thought in a kind of a short-term approach. Why? Because with Hong Kong and the oppression of democracy in Hong Kong, to a certain extent, a large part of credibility will be gone, and credibility beyond Hong Kong will be lost for China. Because what will become of this one nation, two systems approach? Nobody will buy that anymore. In Taiwan, this idea doesn't fly anymore. So what is going to happen with the Taiwan issue? What is going to become of all these military acts of threat? This is my major concern. And secondly, the South China Sea. I will share one thing with you, a little secret. I talked to a leading representative about the South China Sea, and this person suddenly erupted saying, "Why are you so upset about this? The Americans are dominating the Caribbean Sea, and that's not always pretty." Good point. So why are we not allowed to do that? This is the great power and world power instinct. We can do that too. We have a right to do that. And as a post-war German, I can tell you this will not bring about good things. That usually leads to very bleak futures. And I think the rise of China, in large part, was peaceful and should remain that way. But you should not let somebody play tricks on you. This is not a diplomatic virtue to have other people ridicule you and think you're stupid. But with Biden, we will be able to do things and act in ways that were not possible with Donald Trump. And I think that's something we can prepare for. Mr. Fischer, thank you very much for your keynote. Mr. Chariot, thank you very much for the moderation, and so much for that. Now, let's give them a round of applause.